Howdy everyone, it's just Parker today. Mason and I are working on some hardware upgrades and we intend to be back on Twitch soon. But enough of that, let's get right into the subject matter for the day, which is vaccine mandates. Let me take a step back from the most recent news, which involves federal contractors. I want to talk about the federal employee mandate that hit early September, I believe. I should have paid more attention to it then. That's more than a month ago now. It just didn't strike me as, I don't want to say that big of a deal, but that's basically, I thought, well, you're working for the feds. What did you expect? I think was my sentiment. That's at least why I think I didn't pay enough attention to it, because it did not faze me as much as it should have. Anyhow, we're now at the point where we're mandating, not we, the federal government is mandating vaccines for all federal contractors. Now, I have a list of them pulled up here just to give you an idea of the kind of companies that is, because you might think to yourself, the top ones in the list, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, you think, okay, defense contractors, duh. Big military budget, we're buying it from somewhere. Obviously, those are federal contractors, but you wouldn't think that, for instance, Honeywell is a federal contractor or General Electric. It makes sense that they are, but you don't really realize the scope of what is implicated and who is implicated in federal contractors until you start getting down on the list. Deloitte, Accenture, IBM, MIT, AT&T, Microsoft. Turns out to be a lot of people, a lot of companies who each hire a lot of people. Any one of these companies might hire several 10,000 or a few 100,000 people. And they all now are faced with vaccine mandates thrown at them from the federal government or lose their job. Now, I do want to touch on just one nuance here that virtually no media outlet is actually covering. The executive order that is relevant to this mandate is this one, the Executive Order on Ensuring Adequate COVID Safety Protocols for Federal Contractors. You can look that up and find it yourself. Section 2 of this executive order is entitled Providing for Adequate COVID-19 Safety Protocols for Federal Contractors and Subcontractors. That section directs the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, which is generally just called the task force or the COVID task force, directs them to issue some guidance. And I like that they call it guidance. It's not really guidance if it's a mandate, is it? If you're legally bound by it, it's not guidance. It's an order, an edict. Might as well be legislation. And I'm not even going to start talking about legislating from the executive branch, which is a grave violation of the Constitution. But life goes on, and so does this discussion. So it's not the executive order that created this edict. Strictly speaking, the executive order instructed the task force to issue guidance, so-called. And that guidance wasn't released. The executive order was on, I believe it was September 9th. Yeah, that's right. It's like September 9th. The task force came back with their guidance on September 24th. So that's starting to get to be pretty recent. And their guidance reads, well, it reads a lot of things because it's 14 pages, but the operative part of it reads, federal contractors and subcontractors with a covered contract will be required to conform to the following workplace safety protocols. 1. COVID-19 vaccination of covered contractor employees, except in limited circumstances where an employee is legally entitled to an accommodation. Also masking and physical distancing. That's in the second bullet point, which I don't know if we've gotten into this in stream in detail, but I'm just going to touch on it briefly. I really do want to move on to my thoughts on the mandate and the legality of the mandate and the ethical or unethical nature of the mandate. But just as a side note, masking vaccinated people signals to pretty well everyone that the vaccine does not work. I'm not saying the vaccine doesn't work, but if you have to wear a mask whether you're vaccinated or not, a good question would be, why get vaccinated? It must not work very well. Well, there's so many unvaccinated people. Yeah, but you see, what incentive is there to get vaccinated? You see what I'm saying? And obviously, the correct answer to that is there is no actual incentive to get vaccinated other than the merits of the vaccine, which are hotly debated. And the federal government clearly is not interested in that debate because they are mandating from the top of the mountain everyone they possibly can, and many people that they can't, get vaccinated. Basically the entire workforce via OSHA, because that's not gravely unconstitutional. But I digress. So what we've covered so far, just to summarize where we are at now. Every federal contractor, every company that contracts for the federal government, which is a lot of them, must get all of their employees vaccinated. And I believe the deadline, there might be a deadline in here or not. I believe that the deadline is December 8th. Let me look real quick. Yeah. Because covered contractor employees working on a covered contract need to be fully vaccinated after December 8th, 2021. Their employees who work only at a federal workplace need to be fully vaccinated by that date as well, unless legally entitled to an accommodation. Oh, here we go. Here's the actual, that was in the FAQ section. Here's the actual part of the order. Covered contractor employees must be fully vaccinated no later than December 8th, 2021. So, why is that a problem? Because there's a lot of people who support this, if you can believe it. I actually can. It blows my mind that anyone would support this. But if you listen to them, and I have, what they say is, well, we have to end the pandemic somehow. How are we going to end the pandemic if we don't get everyone vaccinated? And let's just pull out the stops to get everyone vaccinated, right? All of them, including the ethical ones. And the unethical ones. All of them. And this is unethical. And that's where I'm headed. If you said, Parker, what do you think is the most basic, most boilerplate, most obvious enumeration of medical ethics yet devised by man? Not having a particularly good historical background in medical ethical standards, but from my relatively well-read study of history, I would suggest a good place to start, at least in modern history, would be the Nuremberg Code. And if you too are a student of history, or at least you were awake when you were a student in history class, Nuremberg ought to ring a bell. Because you would know that the Nuremberg Military Tribunal tried the Nazi officers who were responsible for the Holocaust, those who were still alive after the war, and tried them for war crimes. Now, I'm just going to stop right there because I already know the kind of slander that I am exposing myself to by even bringing up the Nuremberg Code or the Nuremberg trials or the Holocaust at all. What my opponents will say almost reflexively is, how dare you bring up the Holocaust? This isn't anything like the Holocaust. The Holocaust does not belong in a discussion about vaccine. Let me be very clear. I am not suggesting that anything going on in the United States, that any executive order issued by this administration, that any guidance issued by this task force, that any action of any employer is comparable to the Holocaust. I didn't say that. Rewind it. I didn't say that. And I'm not going to say it. And I'm not even implying it by anything I have said or will say, because that's insane. What I am saying is the Holocaust, obviously, was a grave violation. It was a series of grave violations of basic human ethics and dignity, and particularly medical ethics, because many of those who suffered in the Holocaust were not simply killed, they were experimented on brutally and then killed. So, as a result of this military tribunal at Nuremberg, which is a city in Germany if you weren't aware, hence Nuremberg trials, one of the byproducts of that tribunal was the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code is an enumeration of ethical standards in medicine. Let's just say that's a good summary. It's 10 points in a list of standards that must be upheld, in medical experimentation and research. I'm going to read the first few sentences of the first bullet point. It reads, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision." The first bullet point goes on, and then there's 9 others after that, as I've already said. But that's the piece. That's the suggestion, the assertion of the Nuremberg Code that I would like to. It's not a suggestion. It's an assertion that I'd like to focus on. Now, if you're familiar with the idea of informed consent, that's just essentially Webster's definition of informed consent, right? The human subject must voluntarily consent. That's the first sentence of the whole code. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. Not conditionally essential, not usually essential. It is absolutely essential. And it goes on to clarify, just in case you're a fascist piece of garbage, we're not just talking about them saying the word yes under any circumstances. No. This consent must not only be entirely free and voluntary, it must also be properly informed. Now, there are all kinds of things, returning to the original subject, all kinds of ways that informed consent has been wildly violated in the course of this pandemic. I ought to make a whole, I'm going to. I just decided I'm going to make a whole nother episode of this. We'll call it part 2, I guess. And we'll talk about how the informed part of informed consent has been wildly violated in this vaccine campaign. But let's just focus on the consent part. Obviously, if you go to get your COVID vaccine, you consent to it. I hope. If you didn't, call the authorities, right? I mean, if somebody held you down and stuck you, someone should be in jail. But actually, a lot more people than that should be in jail, because even though you consent in that moment, insofar as you sign a piece of paper or you allow the person sticking you to stick you, if you are a federal contractor employee, there's a very easy argument. I mean, it's a layup argument to make that was not free choice. That you did not, as the code reads, you were not, rather, able to exercise free power of choice. Because, as the code continues, you were not without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. This is very broad language. Any form of constraint or coercion. Ask someone who's lost their job, who's been through the experience of losing their job, if being threatened with that could be considered coercion. Ask them if being unemployed, if the adjective duress accurately describes the feeling of being involuntarily unemployed. Threatening someone's livelihood do I have to explain why that's coercion? Are we really at that point? Surely we can just agree. Forget the vaccine issue for a moment. Is it or is it not coercion to threaten someone's livelihood to get them to do something? The correct answer, the only correct answer, is yes. We're not going to debate this. It's already all over our laws. And even in the off chance that your ethical, your moral sense, your moral compass is so wildly incapable of pointing you in the direction of righteousness. Our legal system in countless places has made it illegal to leverage someone's livelihood to get them to do something. If, for example, classic example, your boss, your employer, tries to coerce you into sexual favors, the mere fact that they have control of your employment, even if they don't expressly threaten it, the mere fact that they are asking something from you of that nature, and at the same time you understand that they control your employment, without their express threatening of your livelihood or not. I mean, this was the whole Me Too movement. It didn't actually matter whether Harvey Weinstein ever threatened someone's livelihood or not. He might have not. I don't remember the details of it. But even if he never did, and I'm confident that in many cases he never did, all these girls implicitly understood that's Harvey Weinstein, right? The Weinstein Company shows up in front of all the movies I'm looking to be a part of. This guy matters. He matters to my career. My career is in jeopardy if this guy doesn't like me. And that's enough. That's coercion then, right? And so we understand that they were assaulted, or at the very least harassed. I would argue assaulted, because the consent that they gave to whatever happened was not genuine. Because why? Because they were coerced. Because they were under duress. So, to return to the issue at hand. If you coerce someone into taking a medication, if you put someone under duress and then try to ask for their consent, to have sex with them, to issue them a vaccine, administer them a vaccine rather, or anything else. It doesn't even matter. This is just general consent 101, in case you didn't understand the nature of consent. If the person extending the consent is under duress, if you have by any means, implicitly or explicitly, coerced them to extend their consent, it is not genuine and is not valid. So we'll get into the informed part in part 2 of vaccine mandates. The informed part of informed consent, that is. But the consent part is not even being upheld. Neither the informed part nor the consent part is being upheld. Because if you're getting, look, if you're just lazy and didn't get around to it and you figure, okay, well, I'll just get it because, you know, I don't want to lose my job, but I was meaning to get it anyway. I just don't have control of my life. I'm too busy binging Netflix series to go get vaccinated. And okay, that consent may be genuine, but if it is a violation of your conscience to get vaccinated, if you don't want to, if on the merits of the medication alone you don't want it, you actively don't want it, but you do it because you don't want to lose your job, that is not valid consent. And we are committing that crime on a scale that is difficult to imagine. Is it a minor violation next to the Holocaust? Obviously. I am not suggesting, I have not suggested, and you will not find me suggesting that this is tantamount to the Holocaust. I am, however, saying that it is the same ethical standard that is being violated. To a lesser degree, yes, but the same one. The same basic, boilerplate, rock bottom ethical standard that you do not accept consent from someone, especially concerning their bodily autonomy under these circumstances. That's all I got for y'all. I'll see you in part 2. Thanks for listening.